Today on West Coast Supercars and Classics, we're examining the circumstances behind Richard Hammond's crash of the Rimac Concept 1 Hypercar. The crash happened on June 10th, 2017, at an event called the Bergrennen Hill Climb in Switzerland. Richard Hammond had completed 3 successful runs of the hill climb prior to his crash on the 4th run, where he actually crashed after the finish line. It was an astonishing crash, very disturbing and scary to see, as you probably have seen. It rolled, it probably flew in the air something like 360 feet or about 110 meters. And then it landed upside down with him trapped inside, and it burst into flames. He did manage to get out of it, although he had a fractured left knee. So the question we're all asking is, what caused this crash? Richard Hammond, after all, is quite an experienced driver of hypercars and performance cars. Is the Rimac less safe than a traditional gas engine car? Is there something wrong with the Rimac's engineering that would cause it to be particularly susceptible to this kind of crash? What are the circumstances involving this? The FIA, which is the governing body for these motorsport events, has actually requested that the Swiss organizers of the hill climb present all their data to the FIA for examination, and they may have some sanctions or some disciplinary action involving this, but we don't know at this point. There is no further information. What do we know? Well, let's have a look at the Rimac itself. Setting aside the driver, let's have a look at the Rimac Concept 1, shall we? The Rimac Concept 1 is an electric hypercar built by the company Rimac, named after the founder Mate Rimac, out of Croatia. The company has about 250 employees. The basic specs on the car are: it has 4 electric motors. They're producing a total of 1,100 to 1,200 horsepower and about 1,200 foot-pounds of torque. Those are rough numbers. I've seen slightly different specs depending on maybe the version of the car, when it was released and so on. Now, there were only 8 of these cars manufactured in total. The wheelbase is 108 inches, it's 47.2 inches high, and the total weight is quite hefty at 1,850 kilograms or 4,080 pounds. This is not atypical for an electric car to weigh this much. Typically, the battery packs in these cars add a tremendous amount of weight to them. You just have to realize by doing some calculations, if you've got say in this case, an 80 kilowatt hour or a 90 kilowatt hour battery pack, and the amount of energy that stores, it's going to weigh considerably more than a similar amount of energy which is stored in a fossil fuel. The energy density is just not as good in a battery, even a modern lithium-ion battery. The overall performance stats on this car are absolutely astounding. I mean, it has a 220 mile an hour limited top speed, electronically limited. The 0 to 60 time of this car is probably somewhere around 2.5 seconds. So it is amongst the quickest cars that are on the road today. One might ask if Richard Hammond was qualified to drive a car with this type of performance envelope, and I think that's a question that can't really be answered. Jeremy Clarkson, the other member of the trio that formerly were with Top Gear and are now with the Grand Tour on Amazon Prime, had said about the Rimac Concept 1, I guess it was in the Times of London or something. He called it an amazing and brilliant car, and he said that during his brief time behind the wheel, apparently he couldn't believe how fast it accelerated, and he added, and I quote now, "We're not talking here about something that's as fast as the Lamborghini Aventador. It is massively faster than that. It is faster than anything else I've driven by a huge, huge margin." So setting aside that for a moment, let's look at the actual course itself. As you can see on this Google map of the hill climb, the starting point is over to the east. Now, if you follow that green starting point there, you'll see it wind its way. There's 2 spectator areas also marked in green. The course is marked in purple, of course. If you look to the northwest here, you'll see the finish line and the final spectator area. Now, it was just past that point here where Richard Hammond crashed the Rimac Concept 1. I think it's worth doing a little comparison here between the Rimac Concept 1 and some benchmark hypercars. So here we'll look at the Bugatti Veyron, we'll look at the Ferrari LaFerrari, and last we'll look at the Porsche 918. Now the last two, as you know, are hybrid hypercars with both electric and gas engine drives. The Bugatti Veyron probably has the highest output of the competitor cars that I've mentioned here. In various configurations, the W16 engine, which has 4 turbos, produces probably north of 1,000 horsepower. And I know there's lots of variants on these and lots of customization, so it's really impossible to make a blanket statement about the car that you see in every video. So first off, let's have a look at the Bugatti Veyron versus the Rimac Concept 1. This is seen by the Wilton Classic and Supercar channel. Right off the line, you can see that while both vehicles have four-wheel drive, the Rimac is taking off quite a bit quicker than the Veyron. But the Veyron is gaining definitely on the Rimac by the time they're at speed. Of course, it hasn't passed the Rimac by the time they get to the finish line, but you can imagine, if the race were longer, it might have caught up. But that's a very high benchmark. Next, we have the Rimac Concept 1 versus the Porsche 918. This was seen on Salomondrin's channel. It's a great channel from the LA area. I'm sure you all have subscribed to his channel. Anyways, if you haven't, you should. Yeah, so as you can see from this video, the Porsche 918, which is a very formidable car, was beaten by the Rimac as well. So this shows you the immense torque advantage that the Rimac has, right? It helps it get off the line. Great traction, just like the Tesla P100D, let's say the Model S, makes a great drag car because it's got all this traction and it has 100% of its torque throughout all the rev range, just like any electric car does. That's a huge advantage over a gas engine car. And even with the 918, it's disadvantaged because the Rimac just has that much more torque. And finally, we have the Rimac versus the Ferrari LaFerrari. Of course, the Ferrari does not have the four-wheel drive, so it doesn't have exactly the same traction advantage. But here we see, of course, the Rimac is going to win in a straight-out drag race with that car. This contest between the LaFerrari and the Rimac, by the way, is on Archie Hamilton Racing channel. So now that we've had a look at these comparisons, you can see how quick that Rimac really is. Now let's go back to the hill climb course where Richard Hammond crashed. As I said, he crashed after the finish line, so we're not exactly sure what happened after the finish line. I don't think it was a mechanical failure, according to anybody that's discussed it, including Hammond himself. According to Rimac, Hammond reached a maximum speed of 145 kilometers an hour on the previous runs, where he didn't crash, before reaching that corner. On the last run, he was doing 177 kilometers an hour, which is considerably higher. That's another 32 kilometers an hour higher. Now, the Rimac uses a technique called torque vectoring, where the torque is apportioned between those four wheels up to 100 times a second. It's monitored so that the stability of the car can be carefully controlled. And this really translates into whether it's going to be what we call neutral during a corner, or whether it's going to have oversteer, which means that the rear end is going to want to come out, or whether it's going to have understeer, which means that the front end is going to want to push out. Clearly, in the case of this crash, when you look at this footage, as I'll show you now, you see oversteer happening. So I don't know what setting Richard had the car on in terms of the torque vectoring, but here is what happened. As he approaches the corner, you'll see that there is a right-hand turn followed by a left-hand turn. We'll just slow it down for you so you can see that. It's really hard to see. As he makes the right-hand turn, he goes into oversteer. So that means his rear end starts to lose traction and it starts to slip. He might have brought that on actually himself by braking. Usually when you're doing cornering, you do not brake at the same time in a race car. And just to explain how the dynamics of track racing go, when you're close to the limit of traction, you don't want to be doing braking and turning at the same time. what you want to be doing is you want to be braking in as straight a line as possible, get your speed scrubbed down, and then make the turn. You can do what's called trail braking, where you do your heavy braking, and then as you back off the brake, you begin your turn. That's called trail braking. So it's entirely possible that in this case, he was actually trying to scrub speed off the car while he was executing that right turn, thus putting the car into an oversteer situation. That seems quite plausible to me based on this footage that we're looking at here. I hope you can see from this footage, slow down a little bit, what I'm talking about. Now, it appears as though there were skid marks as well through a lot of this. So let's have a look here. So as he approaches that right-hand turn, if you look at the track in front of him, you do not see skid marks. Now you can see the skid marks being laid down as he gets to the point where he leaves the road, of course. You can see 4 of those as he goes sideways. However, if you back up from there and look further up the road toward the place where I was discussing that oversteer, there are also skid marks there. So he was actually sliding during that period, and he may indeed have had his brakes on. And he lost traction there, started sliding. He tried to make that subsequent left turn, and he was just going way too fast. He didn't have enough speed scrubbed off the car. That's my take on it anyway. I think he may have had up to 30 kilometers an hour excess speed. And it doesn't matter how much torque vectoring and how much fancy technology there is in the car, there is a limit to how much adhesion you have with the tires. And so unless you have a car that has tremendous amount of downforce, big wings and big, aero at the front, you probably won't get enough traction to do the speed that he was trying to do around that corner. And that's why he crashed there. And we can discuss a little bit about the after effects of that crash. Well, he went off the hill, as you know. It was an awful crash because he was airborne and he flipped and all the rest of it. By some minor miracle, he wasn't more seriously injured or killed. And thank goodness for that. I mean, it's just a brutal crash, and nobody wants to see ever that kind of thing. I certainly don't. I certainly never want to see that kind of thing happen. I mean, Richard Hammond himself has been around for a long time. He's a great journalist. He's hilarious, entertaining. And, I've watched a lot of Top Gear over the years, and he's got a great personality and all the rest of it, which he continues to have in these interviews he's done subsequent to the crash. I mean, he's taken it very well. But again, I'm just really glad that he wasn't seriously injured in this. That would have been a horrible tragedy. But this crash does point out some of the issues involved with these hypercars, because they're pushing performance envelopes that we have not ever seen before. When you're talking about, 1,200 foot-pounds of torque, this is on a scale we haven't seen on road-going cars. And I have to start questioning whether these cars have enough aero to back up all that power that they've got. And I mean specifically that if you typically have a race car that has tremendous performance, it obtains some of that performance through aerodynamics, which means it creates its own downforce as it goes. And in fact, a lot of the horsepower that's generated by Formula One cars gets used, in a sense, just sticking it to the ground so it can corner like crazy. I mean, you've got these big fat racing tires too. But if you're going to make a hypercar, that's a street car, it seems to me that you also have to bump up the level of aero that's going to go with these cars to handle that power. Otherwise, you're kind of creating a crazed vehicle which has perhaps far too much horsepower and speed for a road car, and really isn't balanced with the handling. And again, I'm not condemning Rimac at all for this, and I don't think anybody would. I think this is just endemic to the kind of power levels we're seeing out of these cars, as I said. I don't think this is a deficiency with one manufacturer, but it's fascinating to see that even with this modern technology that's available in this car, it can't get you out of that kind of trouble. I mean, there's a limit to how much the electronic nannies are going to help you out. That's it for this episode of West Coast Supercars and Classics. Thanks a lot for watching. We hope you have enjoyed the video. We wish Richard Hammond a speedy recovery from his injuries, and we'll get back to work at the Grand Tour. Please subscribe, share, and like our videos, and we'll keep producing them. Have a great time out there, everybody, and stay safe. Bye for now.
Salomondrin